Welcome to the Timescales Interviews. I'm Grego, your host, and today I have a very special guest, actor, writer, voice artist, impressionist, and so much more. This right here is none other than the extraordinary Steve Nallon. Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm good. Very good. Nice to chat.
Yes, sir. Thank you. This interview is being recorded in California and the United Kingdom. Am I correct that you are in England?
Yes, it's dark here. It's in the evening, about 5 o'clock, and it's quite chilly. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Time. You live in one time zone, and I live in another, and that's possibly, arguably, the earliest example of literal time travel when you're moving from at least one time zone to another.
No doubt. And with this modern technology that we have, we can speak with someone globally at any time. It's pretty amazing. You know, back when Doctor Who started in 1963, who would have imagined that 60 years later we would have these video phones? Pretty amazing time we live in.
Yes, it is, and amazing times to come, I suspect, as well. I think every generation believes that they have probably achieved the maximum technology that is possible. And I suspect the Victorians felt that with their advances. And, you know, the invention of not invention of electricity, but the electric light and telephone. Little did they know what was going to happen in the 20th century, and little did the 20th century know what AI would be doing in the 21st century. So, we're living in a technological world.
What would you imagine things would be in store for in another 60 years?
Well, I think the AI is interesting. I'm a member of the Society of Authors, which is the main society in the UK for novelists and so on. They are very concerned about it. And they are now asking us not to sign a contract which allows the book to be accessed by AI. They think that, in fact, they want us in all our contracts to put a clause in saying the book cannot be accessed by an AI computer, because the worry is that, particularly for factual information, possibly less so for fiction, but for factual information, the accumulation will put people out of work. And I know that I have a friend of mine who works at he's an event organizer for films, and he had to put a season together of a particular film director, and they like to mix it up with the well-known, the less known, and the different themes of that particular director. So he, produced his ideas and sent those ideas in. Out of curiosity, the Institute decided to see what AI would have come up with, and they came up with pretty much the identical season that he had come up with. So
really,
yeah, it's not there yet, and I read of novelists who read AI versions of their writing, and it's not as good, but they recognize the style, and that's fiction. So wow. Yeah, I don't think it's going to affect me so much, but maybe the next generation, I don't know, or maybe we're wrong. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Betamax, if anybody remembers that, which was the one of the earliest versions of video recording, and it was better than VHS, but it never took off. So sometimes we needn't worry too much about technology. And Kindle, interestingly, thought that Kindle would kill off books, physical books, but it never did. And Stephen Fry basically said that an escalator is not going to kill off steps, and that was his analogy, that yes, it's nice to have an escalator and it takes you up, mechanically, but we're never going to get rid of steps. And the great thing about a physical book is you can, it doesn't run out of battery life.
Right. Now, the Betamax, I believe, was the original Japanese device, which was intended for home recording off of television. And I actually recall people saying that, sort of in the style of video killed the radio star, the very concept of recording your own programs at home off of television, or renting or buying movies on tape, be it Betamax or VHS, was going to kill movie theaters. And I think that there was a time where movie theater attendance was down due to home recording and tape access, but it didn't kill the movie theaters.
No, it
So,
didn't, and I think partly because it's still the communal experience of a movie theater. Something you're sharing, particularly with horror movies. You want to share a horror movie with other people who are terrified, and it's the whole experience of going to the movies. In the early days, and I wrote a play with a friend of mine, which was set in Shepperton Studios, which was one of the big British film studios, and I did some research for that, and I went to a lecture on the history of the buildings, and they were known as picture palaces. They were, and the lecturer said, I thought something really very, very interesting. He said, for many working class people, when they went to a picture palace, it was the only time in the week they ever walked on carpet. And I just thought that just sums up an entire social generation of the 20s and 30s who at home lived on floorboards or rugs, but never had carpet. And yet they went to this picture palace and they were walking, and they wouldn't have walked on carpet at work. They were walking on carpet. And I just thought that was such a brilliant insight into how the visit, the physical visit to one of those picture palaces. I know it's the same in America because I've seen all the pictures, all the images. And there are very few of them exist anymore, which is a great shame. But there is something special. I tell you what, I don't know about you, but I think there's something very special coming out of a cinema, and it's still light outside. You're a bit naughty, but you have spent a day or the afternoon and it's still light. I still get that excitement. Oh my, it's still light. And I've been to see an afternoon showing.
Well, I like the term picture palace. That's beautiful. I haven't heard that before.
Well, I'm from the north, and we had mini versions of it, but it was marble, and there was a fountain as soon as you went in to it was called the Clock Cinema, which I used to go to a lot, and it had a fountain. Where in a movie, the many movie houses you get now, you wouldn't have a fountain, and a marble fountain at that, as soon as you walked in. And they made lots of money from it, but I just love the idea that the building itself was a special place to be. And of course, that as soon as then the picture starts, it's a special event, and that specialness will never go. I don't think. I don't think it will ever go. And I think that for my shock going to see a black and white film for the first time on the big screen was a stupid thing to say, but how black and white it was. On television, you get grays, and television still doesn't cope with black. But at the cinema, because it's the magic lantern, it's light and darkness creating those images. I hadn't realized the depth of those black and white movies. Things, Casablanca being an obvious one, but seeing Casablanca on a 35mm print, when you can almost see the celluloid in the image itself, and you get the real depth of the photography, which is never there on television. So there's all sorts of reasons why I think movie theaters will survive. And another reason, which is a purely financial one to a degree, is that a movie needs to develop a reputation before you can buy it on DVD or elsewhere. Although movies are no longer, they don't stay in movie houses now for 6 months or a year or so, like they did in the past with Spartacus, Ben-Hur, and The Sound of Music. But they need to gain their reputation, and they films like Oppenheimer and the one that's Martin Scorsese's one that's just out now, they need the reputation, which is built up primarily at first, at least on a cinema going audience.
Okay. Now, touching on AI just a bit, we're going to jump into your book here in just a moment, but touching on AI, it seems to be that people are all over the board on this, where some people may say that it will never really turn into anything because machines can never fully think in the same manner as the human brain. And on the other end of the scope are people here in California, for example, let's say people that are employed in Hollywood, anything from writers to actors. There are there are many that are concerned that they could be replaced, where scripts could actually be written by AI, replacing the writers, and even extreme examples of where actors can be replaced with AI, and not just animation, where you have an animated movie with an actor voicing it, but the actual recreation of the person itself, such as a terrible thought. What if someone were to bring back Marilyn Monroe or Marlon Brando? You know, do you think that AI is on a level of 1 to 10, how concerning would you say AI is to you?
To me personally, quite low, but I think it's overstated personally, because you mentioned Marilyn Monroe. Well, she depended on the other actor in the scene with her for that spontaneity. And I'm not sure that AI will ultimately be able to reproduce the truth in terms of total spontaneity that she had in front of a camera. And also there was the actress Ellen Terry, the 19th century actress Ellen Terry. She was asked once what star quality was, and it's quoted actually in A Star Is Born, the James Mason, Judy Garland Star Is Born. And I do a bit of a James Mason voice, so I might as well do. Ellen Terry said that star quality was that little something extra. And Esther, you have got that little something extra. And AI does not have that little something extra. It can't, because it's unfathomable. And I think that ultimately, therefore, we can talk about the book in a minute, but one of the things about the book is that we looked at story tropes and the different story tropes in time travel stories that keep reoccurring. Now, there's no doubt that a computer could therefore read that book and others like it about story tropes in all sorts of genres and create probably a very entertaining story. But I can't see it would have that little something extra, and I can't see that it would have the individuality that Monroe had, or any of the big stars, or any of the great writers, because Dickens, I'm a huge fan of Dickens. We talk about Christmas Carol as a time travel story. Dickens was a very, very not disturbed. He was a very complex man psychologically, and I don't know how you maybe AI people could do this, but how do you put into a computer psychotic behavior. And he was a very strange man, very driven, and his inspiration was walking around the streets of London late at night, or he went for very long walks. AI can't go around the streets of London at night on long walks and look in windows and thereby find inspiration. It simply can't do that. But that's what he did. I'm not quite sure how. So they could go through all of his books, and they could certainly reproduce his style. I would have no doubt of that. But would they be able to produce a work of, well, I think, genius like A Christmas Carol? I don't think so.
Okay.
That's my view. I may well be wrong.
Well, very interesting. And I guess we're going to find out, because it seems to be discussions of AI seem to be amplifying rather quickly here recently. Now, you have a brand new book out, which is titled Destination Time Travel. And without any spoilers, there we go. I'm waiting for mine. Without any spoilers, of course, this is a spoiler-free zone. Tell us every single thing about this book. No spoilers. Just
well,
everything.
it's a critical book in the sense that we're looking at time travel stories, primarily what we call for the streaming generation.
Okay.
Those stories that you can find on long form, multiple episodes, but all the many stories that are coming out of places like Spain and Turkey and Germany and Korea, and I watched recently 2 American series, Timeless and Travelers, and these you find on streaming sites. So we haven't really looked at the novels, hundreds and hundreds of novels out there that are time travel stories, but we have looked at the tradition going back to Dickens and Rip Van Winkle, the time sleep story. But we've concentrated essentially on what we think a contemporary television, which hasn't really been covered in almost any book. So there are quite a few books out there that will take you through Back to the Future and Terminator, and we do that as well. We cover Back to the Future and Terminator, and Doctor Who, obviously, but fewer of them are looking at the German series Dark, which has proved to be hugely popular, or the Korean series Alice. And also some of the lost treasures. I think there's a wonderful Christopher Reeve film called Somewhere in Time, which is a beautiful romantic time travel story. It's not an adventure story in the way that the Terminator series is. So that is, and what we have done is that we have essentially, there's not a chapter on one story and then a chapter on another film. It's very much in terms of the headings. I just look at the contents here. So there's one time machines, there's one portals, passageways, gateways, and vortexes, which is your way in. There's another chapter on potions, magic, genii, artifacts, and other tickets to the time travel terminal, time windows, time threads, time beings, time villains, time guardians. So what we're looking at are all the ways of constructing a time travel story. And we also look at things such as the paradoxes of time travel, causal loops, and also to some degree the philosophy and science. We're not philosophers and we're not scientists, and therefore we credit some other and better books than ours there. But we wanted to give the time travel fan a fairly comprehensive look at the whole ideas around what time travel is within a narrative. So that's a sort of a general, very long general summary of it.
Okay. Well, it sounds very interesting, and I would urge everyone to take a serious look at picking this book up. One thing that I do want to mention is for destination time travel. Steve
Yeah, and
Nallon and Dick Fitty.
yeah, and I don't quite know how it works, but there's a Kindle version which I assume would be easier to. And here's the thing: is a nice little. I don't know if you can see this, but the British price is a hardback book. So the British price, which I think you're hoping is 1963.
Oh, really? I didn't notice that.
And we then had a long chat to the American publishers, the American. I said, "What do we do in terms of dollars?" And so we've reversed 1963 to $36.91. So that's a tiny little sort of Easter egg, as it were, in the. And we've put quite a few little jokes like that in, not jokes, but little references to Doctor Who and other stories within the book itself. And I won't spoil it, not as a spoiler, but the book is a sort of time loop because it sort of ends where it began. So that we've put little jokes in like that because we know that the time travel fans like those references, and there's a bit of an awareness of and I think time travel fans are so knowledgeable about how time travel works and very excited when somebody comes up with a new concept or a new idea or a new twist on how you can tell a time travel story and do it in a new and interesting way that hasn't been tried before. So we're aware that we're writing for fans of the genre, essentially.
Okay, very good. Now, for people listening to this on audio, here's a website that you definitely want to check out. You may want to go take a look at it now, or you may want to wait until you finish the interview, and that is Nallon.com, Nallon.com. And then while you're surfing the web, you're going to want to check out Swidgers.com, which we're about to talk about here in just a moment. That is SWIDGERS.com. Now, Steve, on destination time travel, I'm wondering what the writing process was like. Was this something that you just suddenly came up with and approached a publisher and said, "Hey, I have this," or did a publisher approach you and say, "We need something like this," and you got with your co-writer Dick Fitty? How did it all fall into place?
Well, oddly enough, it was a sort of mixture of the two things. Oddly enough, what happened was when I was writing Swidgers, which is a time travel story, the first is called The Time That Never Was. We're going to talk about that later. But as I was writing that, I realized that I had to decide what my time rules were. I had to decide, was the universe changeable? Were time loops possible? How could you know if you change the future that future has been changed? Marty had his Polaroid, and he could see himself disappear or whatever. So I needed to find dramatic devices that did all those things, and whether or not the same person could exist, as it were, in the same time zone. Some stories allow it, some stories don't, and that's the point, really. I realized that all time travel writers had to have thought up the rules before they wrote the story. So I just put a list together of some of the major ones: Back to the Future, Terminator. Decided what their rules were. When you travel back in time and you go back to your own time, has time moved on, or do you go back to the exactly the same moment? So when you in Narnia, in the C.S. Lewis, it's not really time travel, but when they go into the wardrobe and go to Narnia, and they may stay there for several months, years, or whatever, but when they come back, time has not moved on. Stephen King does something very similar in his in his book about JFK. And all those rules you have to decide. So I wrote them. I wrote quite a long sort of essay, essentially for search engine optimization, because I put it on my Swidge's website in the hope that, you know, fans of time travel would find it, and then they would find the book. And then the publisher read it and he said, "No, we've got to publish this. We've got to publish this." And I said, "Well, I'm, you know, it's a lot of work writing a book. It's fine for the internet. The writing is fine for the internet, but it needs to be a lot better for a published book." So I rang up Dick, who I've known for 30 years, who's the archivist at the British Film Institute, and who's a huge Doctor Who fan and has encyclopedic knowledge of pretty much all popular culture. And he'd helped me anyway with some recommendations and some films I've never seen. And I said, would you like to write it? And he said, yes, please. And we are putting together, as it happens, a time travel season at the British Film Institute, and that's all going to tie in nicely. So so the book was sort of semi-written before Dick came on board, but Dick made major contributions to it, and, you know, some great ideas. And so that's sort of how it all came together. Yeah, it was a great guy, and it was a great, you know, partnership, I felt.
Okay, very good. Now this may seem a little bit obvious, but do you happen to be a fan of Doctor Who yourself?
Well, yeah. I mean, time travel is interesting in the 60s and 70s in the UK. We had time tunnel, which was obviously came from America. We also had Star Trek, which has quite a few time travel stories. But we had Doctor Who, a series called Time Slip, which is about children who go through a fence and time travel. We had a series called Catweasel, which is about a wizard from 900 years ago that found himself in modern England. And actually, I realized that back in the early 1970s, you could, as a child, and I was born in 1960, so I was about 10 or 11 in the early 70s, you could pretty much watch a time travel story every single day of the week. And we had another one called The Tomorrow People. And I mention that because Doctor Who was, of course, the most famous of all of them. And I lived, many Doctor Who fans will have exactly the same story I'm going to tell you, or a version of it. But let me tell you mine. I lived in a terraced house in Leeds, which basically meant that you went straight from the pavement on the street into the main living room, the only living room, really. However, we had a little porch area as you came in from the street, and it was a square box shape. And that meant that as a 10-year-old kid, I could be in my living room, I could look at this square shape, but it had a door on it, and I could go in through that door. I could then close my eyes, make the TARDIS noise, and then exit onto the street into another world. And that's what I did, because that was my fantasy, was Doctor Who, and the little porch area, little square area, was my TARDIS. And I wouldn't be surprised if pretty much every Doctor Who fan had a sort, particularly encountering it as a child. And my doctors were Patrick Troughton, and towards the end, I mean, I don't remember William Hartnell, but Patrick Troughton was my first Doctor. And like many fans of Doctor Who, I didn't like the next one at first, and then John Pertwee rather grew on me, and I got to like him. And then of course, Tom Baker. After Tom Baker, I was sort of probably 16 or 17, and I then stopped watching it. To be honest, I felt that Peter Davison was a bit young, and Tom Baker had been, to me, genius Doctor Who. All of them were in their different ways. I'm not going to choose between them, but probably from a formative point of view, Pertwee and Tom Baker. And again, when Tom Baker came along for the first few episodes, I didn't like him very much, and then he was just won me over. And I'm sure actually Peter Davidson would have done so had I stuck with it. And I've worked with Peter. I did a program with him. He's a great guy.
Okay, very good. You worked with Peter Davison. What
yeah,
was the program?
we made a pilot together, a radio pilot together, and he was playing a sort of version of Tony Blair, not Tony Blair, but he was playing a version of Tony Blair. And we then actually went on and changed the casting, and we had Mark, who is the Mr. Weasley in Harry Potter. So he then became our Prime Minister. I'm not quite sure why Peter was great, and he did a very good job. I never met John Pertwee, though I did see him on stage. Oddly enough, I think he was in Christmas Carol. I have a memory as if he played the Ghost of Christmas Past, but I may be wrong about that. But yes, over the years I've met Sylvester McCoy and I've met Tom Baker as well. Yeah, it is a bit of a thrill, you know. I mean, I do voiceovers and stuff, and Tom Baker was sat next to me in a voiceover studio, well, in reception rather than the studio, and it is just a bit weird when your childhood hero Doctor Who is sat next to you having a cup of coffee, and he put his thumbs up to me because I smiled at him. And he probably felt that we'd worked together in the past, and I was just thrilled just to get his big smile, Tom Baker's big smile, and a big thumbs up. That was the thrill of the day for me, I remember.
He also has a rather booming, commanding voice.
Oh, brilliant
as
yes,
well.
Yes,
yeah.
and he. And I worked with many actors that worked on Doctor Who. I don't know if this is well known, but it probably is for the fans. There's a place where Doctor Who was rehearsed, which was known as BBC North Acton, and it was it was basically a tower block where all the rehearsals were done for pretty much every BBC show. So I used to work there a lot, and I went down in the list with John Gielgud, and you could see Dirk Bogart, and you could see comedians mixing with actors. And the point is that Tom Baker, I think, was going through a personal sort of relationship crisis, and he was always very early on a morning. He always seemed to be there at North Acton earlier than anybody else, and often stayed to have something to eat. And then they discovered he was actually sleeping there because he had nowhere else to live. And he was sleeping in the rehearsal studios at North Acton.
Wow.
Because he was, I mean, the thing is that with him, John Pertwee, I knew of anyway. He had been a big star in radio. I was a big fan of radio comedy. So I knew him from a series called The Navy Lark back in the late 60s, which I was a huge fan of comedy radio. And so I knew who John Pertwee was. I didn't know who Tom Baker was, but then I did later watch his performance as Rasputin, but you wouldn't have recognized Tom Baker as Rasputin because of all the hair. Yes, it was just a thrill when you meet these people.
Oh, wow. Have you ever met Katie Manning or Elizabeth Sladen?
Oh yes, I was very lucky. The 10 years ago, the British Film Institute had every month they had a celebration of each of the Doctors, and it went right up to what would have been the present day, and I think then which was David Tennant, and Tom Baker was there, and Christopher Eccleston was not there, but he sent an email to a friend of mine who then read out the email. So they still celebrated. Luckily, I knew the people there, and I hadn't realized this, but these afternoons were always sold out within about 10 minutes.
Wow.
But they always kept some private tickets back. So I was very, very lucky. I was invited to the green room where, you know, where we could meet people like Katie Manning and David Tennant, and the only one who didn't allow that was Tom Baker, but he was very frail at it still isn't terribly well, but he was beginning to get frail, and he didn't want many people around. But no, I got to meet and I'd worked with Michael Troughton, who Patrick's son. I had done a television series with him, you know, and so that was, but that particular year was great because every month basically we went and celebrated each of the Doctors, and they showed probably their best, or what was often regarded as their best show, or their best storyline. And you saw how different they all were. And David Tennant was very generous with his time, and very generous to the fans, and very funny. And then more recently, the Christmas episodes were previewed at the British Film Institute.
Okay.
And Bradley Walsh, who I was on a show back in 1985 with, who I've known, you know, for many, many years, and we did a series together, a radio series together, and I bump into him occasionally. So he's very funny. He's a naturally funny man. He's a comedian. And when he's on the panel, the Doctor Who panel, he basically takes over the entire panel and just makes everybody laugh. He's enormous. He's enormous fun. So I was often lucky enough to be invited to the preview of the Christmas or New Year different specials over the years. That doesn't happen now for various reasons, but pretty much every year up until COVID, I got an invitation to go along and enjoy the show.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, we're going to switch away from Doctor Who here, and let's meet the author a little bit. I want to ask you about your 2022 publication, The Time That Never Was. But shifting away here for just a moment, since we're about our halfway point, I want watchers and listeners to be able to get to know you a little bit and relate to their author. So this is the only broad, open-ended question that I have for you today. Could you tell us what an average day in life is like for Steve Nallon?
Well, today I always get up very early, and by early it's normally sort of 6:30, 7 o'clock. I like to work in the morning, and today was odd because I was doing a radio interview promoting Destination Time Travel, and that wouldn't normally happen. But on a normal day, I would probably write for 4 or 5 hours, and then my brain just goes wah, 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 wah. And then I stop, and maybe I might do some corrections after lunch, but in the evening I would probably watch a movie. And so I live my neighbors don't understand me because I genuinely say to them, "What day is it today?" And they look at me as if, "What do you mean what?" And they've got children, and they have things like weekends. And I said, "Is it Wednesday or Thursday today?" "Steve, it's Friday. It's Saturday tomorrow." "Is it?" Time in that sense makes no difference to me. I work every single day. I don't distinguish between Saturdays and Sundays and Mondays and Tuesdays. They're pretty much all the same to me. The only day I do not work is Christmas Day, which I refuse to work on Christmas Day. But I've certainly worked New Year's Day. I just got up and, well, what am I going to do? Well, I can't just sit around doing nothing. So but that I won't work Christmas Day. That's the only day of the year I won't work. So but I don't burn the midnight oil. I'm a lark, not an owl. And I think a lot. I think that sounds maybe a stupid thing to say, but most of my time, most of my work is in my head before I write it. And the writing, I find, and other people who say this, I know Richard Curtis, and he has written a time travel movie and stuff. You've got probably, I think, 3 or 4 creative hours in you a day. And after that, the brain decides not to work. I mean, that's certainly my experience. And I know it was his as well. And then you go off and you hopefully socialize with friends, but I live alone, so that's more difficult for me. But yeah, it didn't used to be like that. You know, I was an actor for a very long time and voiceover artist. I do have a studio next door, a voiceover studio, a recording studio, and I have done video games. Yeah, I've done video games. I've been intending to do more audio books. I have done them in the past, and because of my background doing voices, I wanted what is now known as the enhanced audio. So I'm working with a producer and who's a great editor and stuff like that, and post-production. So nowadays, just reading a script isn't reading a book isn't good enough. Because people expect there to be an element of performance in it, and you know, an element that you're more a storyteller than a reader. So I would say I'm a storyteller, and a storyteller has to put in a degree of performance. So there are many people who do audiobooks who say, and they've said to me, they said, no, Steve, let the words do the work. And I say, well, you know, when we speak, we give words meaning by our intonation and the thought behind them. So I don't think it's quite good enough now just to say, let the words do the work. I think you have to be you have to know what the words mean, and to some degree give them your own meaning, which isn't. I think it's moving towards that way, that style and that presentation, and that's the way. But of course, what that means is I can't do a book in 2 days. It takes me days and days and days because of all the preparation to do. So, and I do lots of different voices, and you know, and I borrow from all the voices that I've done in the past. So John Hurt, as you know, an actor from Doctor Who, I've been impersonating him since he played Caligula in I, Claudius back in the 1970s. And John Hurt has one of those wonderful voices that is incredibly theatrical and yet remains real and believable. He doesn't quite do it like that in Doctor Who, but he's got a wonderful voice. So I've got him to play Squealer in my version of Animal Farm. And then you borrow other voices. I mean, I'd give you some example. I'm very good at British actors.
Ian McKellen, you know, he's got what I call a sort of, he's like a train engine that's just getting going and starting up, and then he chugs along. He's a great fugger, and then he'll suddenly come out with a bit of a punch in his voice.
And Derek Jacobi, I mentioned him because I've been doing him since he played Claudius in I, Claudius back in the 1970s, and he's also been the master, of course.
And Derek Jacobi has a very rich, beautiful voice in the style that goes back to such people as John Gielgud. It's that wonderfully beautiful, mellifluous voice. And I also do John Gielgud. John Gielgud is a lovely voice to do. And so all these voices I'm trying to put into the stories or I adapt them, you know. So I do think, oh, who can play God? You know, if I wrote a story with God, who could play God? So it would be a choice probably between Ian McKellen and Derek Jacobi. So so you've got a casting list. I'm sort of a casting director as who's going to play what character, and I've always done British prime ministers that many of them nobody will have heard of, but you know, so the major, the old pig in Animal Farm, I based that on a prime minister we had called James Callaghan, who was, let me say, he was slightly like that, and he sounded as if he could have been called Old Major. Nobody knows whether that's accurate or not, but it's just the right voice. And that's how I write as well. That's how when I'm writing my stories, I write in pencil. And when a new character comes up, I think, well, which voice shall I give it? Who shall I base it on? Of course, you then realize that as you're doing a voice, physically, the syntax of that voice changes, and it has to change because people's rhythms are completely different, and without realizing it, you find a variety of syntax and ways of speech within the character on the page.